Advisory Committee, and the Chicana Studies Department. We are so proud and so thrilled to invite Felicia Lowe, the filmmaker, Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, here to our campus for a special screening of her documentary, Chinese Couplets. Felicia obviously is here today, and she will be available at the end of the film to take any questions that you might have. For us, I will be moderating the Q&A portion. I just want to say quickly, this is a time of interesting developments with regards to the immigration debate in our nation's history. Policies having real impact on human lives, right? Historically as well as presently. And so we do believe that this film is very timely and very important, particularly to our Mesa student and faculty and staff population. And therefore, we believe that this is appropriate. And we know that we have the generous support of our administrators here, particularly Pamela Lester, who will also be saying a few words. Before I have her stand up, I do want to do a couple of housekeeping things. In case you have to exit relatively, please use the back exit door. We also do have cookies and lemonade available, so if you feel like you got a little bit of the munchies, okay, just go on over and discreetly get some snacks, okay? The film is approximately an hour long, I believe, so it should be within the time frame of this class period. And of course, questions afterwards. Now at this point, I'd like to introduce President Pamela Lester, who has graced us with her presence this morning and will say a few words of introduction.
Thank you very much. I am also loud, so I will use my 5th grade girls basketball coaching voice. One of the reasons I was really honored to be invited here today is exactly what Gloria is talking about in terms of how important it is for us to always be learning about the history of our nation and the place that immigrants have had in it. We have entered a time where somehow, in some way, there has been a determination that somehow the immigrant story, the immigration of all of us, most of us, to this soil that we live on, is somehow no longer seen in a positive light in terms of some of the leadership that's happening on the other coast. I'll say it like that. And I think it's so important that we continue to learn as much as we can about the historical value of immigration to the United States and the historical nature of what strength that brings to the work that we do every day at Mesa College. The only way we can transform our own understanding about events that go on around us is to have open hearts and open minds to what others bring to our own experiences. I don't have the experience of being a Chinese immigrant, but I'm excited to learn today from this beautiful film what that looked like. I did grow up in the Bay Area, so very, very much had the Bay Area experience, but certainly not one of being in a family that was experiencing that experience. So I think at a college, regardless of your political point of view or anything else, unless we're willing to have open hearts and minds and listen to each other and learn from one another and listen to the historical perspectives that build what we do, it's very difficult to have your own sense of who you are, and it's very difficult to have a sense of who we are as a community just here at Mesa. So I am very excited to be here. I will be one of those people exiting. I apologize. I do have another meeting that I'm going to run off to eventually. But I want to say to you that I'm happy that you're all here. I'm happy that you're here at this event, and I'm happy that you're here at Mesa. So thank you for inviting me to say a few words, and I'm very interested with an open heart and open mind to view this film. Thank you.
I can't tell you how happy I am to be here because it's really been more than a year since, whoa! We began. That's called an entrance. To catch your imagination. Can I ask, with the show of hands, how many of your grandparents were immigrants? How many parents were immigrants? Thank you. And yourself, are you an immigrant? It's always just 1 or 2 generations away, and maybe for some, maybe even further back. But I know as I was coming up, the representation and the stories I was told was really the Ellis Island story. Immigrants are all welcome, the Statue of Liberty was there with open arms, you know, and you're all welcome to be here. It would take many years, and throughout my college education, very little was ever said about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was the first racially based immigration restrictive law. First time ever that they began to implement restrictions. They did not want Chinese laborers, and that law lasted till 1943. Both my parents came before the exclusion was repealed, and that set forth a pattern within the culture itself, oftentimes of secrets and silence. So even as an American-born, Chinese American-born, I knew very little about my own history, about the history of my parents, because they were very quiet and secretive about their past. So this film was set out to find some answers, and it was really kick-started by my daughter, who, when she was in high school, was asked to look for a photo and get the research of why the photo was taken, and she happened to pick a photo of my mother as an infant in China. And when she asked why the photo was taken, my mother told her it was for my father, who left for Cuba before I was born. And I didn't meet him until I was a teenager. Mind you, I was a grown woman at that point and had never heard the story, and I really felt like, what else don't I know? So I hoped in seeing the film, it might pique your interest, not only in the specifics, because we all have stories to tell, but also about the universal shared experience of what it means to be an immigrant and how that affects your relationship to your children, your grandchildren, and in fact, how it affects your sense of who you are in this country. So from immigration to your own sense of identity, is there a line there or not? And how does race play into this? And what are some of the repercussions of race as it's perceived and interpreted by those around us? And who defines who we are? You know, from the inside, within our families, within our communities, within the outer world. So may this film prick some thoughts and ideas in your mind, and we will talk more about it after the film. Thank you.
Again, I want to thank Felicia for being here today and for sharing her very touching and powerful family story, a story of immigration, a story of connection. I'm a daughter of immigrants myself. My parents immigrated here in the 1970s from Korea, South Korea, and like your story, it's a story of secrets as well. I don't know what secrets, but this makes me want to go and dig a little further, particularly on my mother's side. So this was very personally a touching film. I believe Shirley in the back has passed along surveys for everybody to fill out, so we would definitely appreciate if you can fill that out and turn it into somebody or bring them up front at the very end. Also, just a plug, if you're my student in History 142, I have the homework assignments that you need to pick up from me. Okay. But at this moment, I am going to moderate a question and answer period. So if you have any questions for Felicia Lowe, I will actually be walking around with a mic, hopefully, to ensure that your questions can be heard, and Felicia will stand up here and answer whatever questions you might have. So I'll take raised hands, and first ones I see I'll go to. Right.
I have to say one of the real benefits of having done the research for this movie was to discover what a heroine my grandmother was, because this was somebody I didn't know anything about. So it's been an incredible learning experience throughout, from the beginning, to begin to search for some answers and to learn who my mother became based on the experiences she had in China and her journey here, and who I became as a result of her experience and the opportunities that were provided because I was born here. And growing up in Berkeley in the 60s shaped me in many ways, just as war for her shaped her.
Hi, I'm with the women's 142 class. My name is Savannah Pontier. Thank you for sharing your story first and foremost. That was very inspiring. My question for you is did that whole experience bring you and your mom closer? Did you guys break down barriers that you hadn't broken down before?
Absolutely, and I have to really credit my daughter for, I think, breaking the first chink in my mother's armor, because, you know, and I always encourage young people like yourself to say, but Grandma, it's a homework assignment. I have to find out about this. Because it was through that method that my mother began to open up to her. And it could just have been the passage of time also. But I was also very fortunate that my daughter, when she attended college, continued her search into her grandmother's past. And so she interviewed my mother at great length. She took a course in Asian American women's studies, and as a result, out came a beautiful album that had interviews transcribed and photographs and a documentation that my daughter served as a bridge was something that I was grateful for. And I would say that even as I became a mother to my daughter and experienced the experience of my daughter's health issue, you know, when she had cancer as a baby. And that was something that my mother very much related to because she had lost a child about that age. That experience, because my mother stepped up and didn't step back, really began to bring us closer together. But it's been a journey. And, you know, I know oftentimes when I've shown the film that children of immigrants, there is a gap. You know, my daughter and I grew up here in America, have the same education, and have many more common experiences than my mother and I had. So there was a bigger distance between us. And of course, here I was poking around asking questions when she wanted to be very private. So there was that tension, but I think, as I'm often asked, do you think your mother would have liked this film because she died before it was completed? And I think that she, at the end, would, because I think she liked seeing herself on screen. Yes?
Hi, I'm also part of the Women's History 142, and thank you very much for sharing your story with us here today. My question is that how was it finding out about your mother's story? Did that affect your kind of identity as being a Chinese American woman, especially first generation here? Because I know it can be kind of a difficult thing for those who consider this like a dual identity for being a first generation. And how did that affect your daughter as well? Like, how was that for her changing as well?
I think my daughter has really always had a pretty good sense of herself, and I think it shows. You know, she's very honest, and I was talking to a friend of mine who actually came to Mesa College. This is a colleague that we both entered into the news business at the same time, and he's now moved back to San Diego and actually, as I said, attended Mesa College and told me that you guys started one of the first Chicano studies programs here. But we were saying that when we were coming up, this whole identity politics was just arriving. You know, from the civil rights movement came the Chicano movement, the African American studies, Asian American studies, all of that was an outgrowth of that time in history. And what he was saying, and my daughter is biracial, is that, for many of your generation, the race issue can be very profound still, but it can also, depending on where you live, can be more moderated. That there's more acceptance of interracial marriages, mixed race children. It really depends on where you are in the world and how you perceive it. So in terms of my own identity, I think that it was very powerful to have come up in that time period where we were saying, look, I'm sick of hearing about the mainstream. The mainstream for me is the stream I'm standing in. And that really helped in terms of beginning to understand our history, our part of our history in American history. Did I ever hear about Angel Island Immigration Station? Not at all. And that was really the counter to Ellis Island. They would call it a bookend, but the fact of the matter is it was a bookend that was saying stay out of America, whereas Ellis Island was welcome. So, when you have that context, when you get that historical context, like I said, even in the film, when I understood where my mother was coming from, that phrase, where are you coming from? It makes a difference when you know some of those answers. She came from poverty. She came from a war-torn country. There was a single mom there. And still that single mom in a culture, like many, that just wants to get the boys out of there and to promote and advance the sons, she got 2 daughters out of there. And so, it gave me an appreciation I could not have had if I didn't know. And that's why I encourage you to maybe probe and ask some of these questions now if you have grandmothers or parents even around who would be willing to talk to you. My mother resisted me for a long time. Somehow it was easier for her to talk to her granddaughter. But out of that, we all came closer together. And to answer your question, I don't think my daughter is a biracial person has the same kind of issues around race as I did. But I really grew up in a time where they had just books. You might recognize Dick and Jane. They were just white people. Everywhere you looked on television, white people, right? So that was equal to being American. And so if you were a person of color, and even to this day, some of you may have experienced it. Where are you from? I mean, where are you really from? Not understanding that, the statistics have changed. In the days of 20th century, the people who came to America, 80% came from European countries, 20% from the other. Now it's flip-flopped. 80% come from Asia, Latin America. So now our numbers are changing and it's reflected in our population. So, America's looks are changing, and that's why I had the epilogue in the citizenship swearing-in ceremony. Who you saw being naturalized were mostly people of color, because that's what it is like now.
How do you fellow Berkeleyan of the 1960s and 1970s? You and I got to talk for a few minutes. I grew up in Berkeley too. Where did you go to UC Berkeley then?
No, I ended up going to San Jose State. I wanted to get away from home.
So what did you study, and did your mother support your aspirations for higher education?
Yes, absolutely. There was no question that there was going to be higher education from that standpoint. But what I did major in was journalism. And that was rather rare for my generation and among their friends. They would say, well, how about being a teacher or something that was more familiar to them. But I did pursue journalism, and because of that, I have to credit my parents for not stopping me from doing this. So through journalism, I then got further training, and it harks back to what was going on in the late 60s and early 70s. but there were many programs that do not exist now called affirmative action training programs. And this was a time when they were investing money and training programs to try to get more people of color and women into different fields. I had moved to New York. I was working at Children's Television Workshop. I worked on a show called The Electric Company. Did some of you see that show? And out of that, I was able to get training in film, which I became interested in, because I could see it's a dynamic medium. You know, you can really see exposed stories to many, many people. And so I got into a program at Columbia where I was trained to do broadcast journalism and actually became the first Asian reporter at the ABC affiliate in San Francisco. That's how long ago it was. I mean, it's not that long ago. I'm talking about the 70s, but it's now, you know, Asian women on television is like a new stereotype. There's so many. But it gave me entree into a world of storytelling in which I had to be very concise in that storytelling because, as you know, news reports are 30 seconds. You know, a minute and a half was a long story. But what I discovered for myself was I appreciated the impact of the storytelling and how to reach people, but I was hungry to tell stories with a little more depth. And from there, I began to work at some television stations and did what's called field producing, where I would produce stories that were 10 to 20 minutes long, and then eventually got into documentary filmmaking. Chinese Couplets is the fourth full-length documentary I've made. I made one, you saw segments of my documentaries in this film. That's called repurposing. In 1979, did my first half-hour documentary for PBS called China Land of My Father, where I went to China to meet my grandmother for the first time, on my dad's side. And then in 1988, I released Carved in Silence, which is a film that's focused on the experiences of the Chinese who were detained at Angel Island Immigration Station. And they were detained there for so long that they carved poetry on the walls. And to this day, you can see them. At that time, I also got involved in the restoration of the immigration station. So if you ever get up to San Francisco, in San Francisco Bay, sometimes they call it the other Alcatraz because it was like a prison. But we're setting up a Pacific Coast Immigration Museum there because we need to hear this story as well. And you know, when you hear what's going on in the immigration scene, the policies that are being proposed, it's frightening to me, and I feel those of us who have been felt the repercussions of Chinese exclusion need to step up and talk about it, because the Muslim ban is no different. You know, it's another version of selecting out a group of people and saying, we don't want you here, and damage is caused by that. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did.
Thank you.
All right, I do want to interrupt because the class session's about to end, but we will have Felicia here until 1 o'clock if you'd like to stay and have a more intimate discussion with the filmmaker as well as some of the professors who helped organize this. There are cookies and brownies and goodies back there. Please take, because we want you to, we're not going to eat it all. Lemonade and water here if you need a quick beverage. And those of you that like to stay for intimate discussion, please stick around because I'm sure there are so many more stories to tell. So thank you all for being here. If you're my student, come see me.